God morgon från Paretodesken onsdagen den 1 mars. Vi stängde ner något ner i USA under gårdagen. Det var nedåtlutande under hela handelsdagen och S&P stängde ner minus 0,3. Det innebar att S&P 500 var ner 2,4% för hela februari. Det är fortfarande positivt för året, men det är ett ganska stor scenförändring i februari jämfört med den starka starten vi hade till i januari. Inflationsdata har kommit in starkare än väntat, vilket har påverkat räntorna som har skjutit i höjden. Korträntorna i USA är upp över 60 punkter de senaste veckorna, så det här har ritat om kartan för aktier och lägger press på marknaden helt enkelt. Vi har Fed-möte om 3 veckor, mars 21-22 mars. Och där förväntar sig marknaden en höjning med 25 punkter. Men sannolikheten för en 50 punkters höjning har gått upp ordentligt under februari. Så det här beskriver bilden lite i vilken miljö vi befinner oss i. Och för att kasta ytterligare ljus på marknadssituationen så har vi med oss Harry Colvin från Longview Economics. So after a strong start to 2023 in January, we've given back most of the gains, and the stock market now seems to be contemplating which direction to take. With us to clear this picture is Harry Colvin from Longview Economics. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. I mean, I think you're right. We've now seen a little bit of a turn in markets after a very strong start, and I think a lot of that strength at the very start of the year was driven by a bit of extra liquidity around, particularly coming from the US, from the Fed. We've had the Treasury drawing down on its account at the Fed, so that bank account balance that the Treasury has at the Fed has been drawn. And that has essentially meant that the Treasury hasn't been drawing liquidity from markets by issuing bonds. And that's basically offset the impact of QT. So there's been a bit of extra liquidity from the Fed. There's also been a bit of extra liquidity in Japan, which they've been continuing to pretty rapidly expand their balance sheet with their yield curve control program. That's added some more liquidity to markets as well. So essentially that, I think, has been one of the key drivers of the strength in markets we saw up until early February. There's also been other factors at play as well. Of course, we've had a big fall in the gas price, a warmer winter in Europe. We've had the reopening of China's economy, and a lot of good news has been coming into the price. I think what's interesting is the way the narrative has changed. It's flipped from very bearish back in October, November last year, when most people surveyed in the Merrill Lynch Fund Manager survey were expecting recession. It's now only about 25% of those surveyed who are expecting recession. So the narrative has changed. There's now the dominant story of soft landing or indeed a no landing. And I think often this is what happens in bear market relief rallies. The price bullies opinion switches from deeply bearish to pretty optimistic. And by the time you get there, of course, it's usually the end of the bear market relief rally and the bear market resumes. Now, whether the bear market resumes or not really depends on the macro, doesn't it? And I think the macro is pretty poor. I think the underlying trend in markets is down. Liquidity is going to be tightening up over coming months and quarters probably. And I think markets need to they're going to be increasingly pricing a recession and pricing a contraction in earnings. So I think there are lots of factors that are going to be driving markets lower. Positioning, of course, is now on side for the bears because there's so much bullishness around and so much expectation of a soft landing and so on. So I think that this potentially is a turning point from early February. Potentially, it's the resumption of the bear market.
Thank you, Harry. Question on the liquidity side there. So you mean that the Fed actually supported markets with its own sort of balance sheet in the beginning of this year, and that ability is less so going forward, or how should we interpret it?
Well, the way to think about it is that the Fed in isolation is conducting QT, and that drains liquidity from the system. What's been happening, what's a bit different about the last month or so, is that the Treasury has been drawing down on its cash balance at the Fed. This is its general account at the Fed. And normally what would happen, of course, is the Treasury would issue bonds. And so they'd be sucking up money from markets. This time, instead of sucking money out of markets, they've been sucking money out of the Fed. And that has essentially neutralized what's been going on with QT. The liquidity impact of QT has been somewhat neutralized by that. So it's not that the Fed has done anything, it's more that the Treasury has done something, and that's been somewhat neutralizing the impact of QT.
Treasury's ability to continue to do that maneuver is how does that look?
Well, this is where the debt ceiling debate becomes quite interesting, because there's one argument you can make, which is, well, you know, until they raise the debt limit, they're going to be the Treasury will be somewhat restricted, and it will have to rely more than normal on its balance at the Fed. In which case, you could make the argument for a bit more liquidity in markets from the Fed over the next couple of months. You could make that argument. So we'll see. I mean, I think this is all part of the puzzle, isn't it? It's one of the pieces of many other pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. Another piece is rate expectation. And it seems like the market, the bond market is now sort of more on the Fed side, that rates will stay higher for longer. Can you give us a little bit description of what's happened on the curve and how it looks?
Yeah, I mean, we've been dramatically pricing in more hikes at the very front end of the curve. We've priced probably, I would say, 50 basis points in the last several weeks, more hikes. I mean, I'd have to check that, but it's something like that. It's a pretty dramatic repricing, and that, of course, has been one of the drivers for generally higher bond yields, but also much weaker equity markets. All driven, of course, largely by that very strong inflation number we had. I mean, we've had strong PPI, CPI was strong. Particularly, I think what's been troubling markets is that services, especially services ex medical care, actually medical care services was a very weak number. So when you strip that out, then the services number ex medical care was about 0.8% month on month, which is a very big number. So it's telling you service sector inflation is actually proving to be pretty sticky. We also had a strong PCE number last week as well. So there's a lot of inflation around, and markets are panicking about that a little bit, and perhaps they keep pricing in a little bit more in the front end, and that you know puts more downward pressure on equity markets. So this is the theme, isn't it? And until markets really believe that inflation's been broken, then this may well remain a theme.
Yeah. So we have a few important data points coming up here in the next couple of weeks. How should we navigate markets in the very short term?
Well, we're going to get the ISM readings this week, and they're pretty important. And it may well be we get a bit of a bounce. Possibly the data is better than expected. I mean, there is a lot of data that's just bouncing a little bit in the last month or so. You know, I wouldn't want to read too much into one number, but that might push markets around a little bit. So ISM is really key. Inflation out of Europe is pretty important. This week is a big inflation week for Europe. And look, I mean, the ECB has been very hawkish. Money looks way too tight in Europe. I suspect we've got another 100 basis points of hikes priced into the Euribor curve. So it's an enormous amount of tightening. We've already had a few hundred basis points of hikes out of the ECB. We've got more to come. I think this is a big problem for Europe, which is really a very structurally weak and vulnerable economy. Lots of indebtedness, terrible demographics, low productivity growth. I mean, this is an economy that is vulnerable to shocks, and we are witnessing an interest rate shock in Europe. So at some stage, we'll start to feel the impact of that. Arguably, we're already beginning to feel some of that with weaker house prices in certain key economies, certainly Sweden, but also Germany.
Okay, that's highly interesting, Harry. Thank you so much for good insights, and we'll speak again soon on this theme.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks. I övrigt från Pareto så släpper vi vår månadsportfölj för mars idag. Vi gör 4 stycken ändringar där vi tar in Caliditas, Camurus, Sedana och Tele2. Vi tar ut Storytel, East9, Filo och SKF. Portföljen underpresterade tyvärr i februari och var ner 1,3% medan marknaden var svagt upp. Då. Så vi hade en underperformance på ungefär 250 punkter. Utöver det så har vi uppdateringar på Jetpack och Linas matkasse. Båda lämnade rapporter igår. Jetpacks rapport anser vi var stabil och bra med hyfsat goda utsikter för 2023. Värderingen fortsätter att vara väldigt konservativ. Vi förväntar oss förvärv som kan hjälpa till att driva på tillväxten som annars väntas ligga kring 5-6%, mesta drivet av pris. Vi har en köprekommendation på Jetpack med en riktkurs på 125 kronor. Linas fortsätter att ha det kämpigt. Man gör vad man kan för att kompensera tuffa marknadsförhållanden genom kostnadsbesparingar. Då. Så att man slog på marginalen så slog man våra förväntningar, men det är fortsatt kämpigt på topline. Vi gör en del justeringar som följd av den här rapporten och framförallt som följd av lite förändringar i deras långsiktiga guidning kring marginal. Vi behåller vår köprekommendation och riktkursen kommer ner till 11 från tidigare 12 kronor. Bolaget är extremt lågt värderat, men det behövs en vändning i sentiment för att se att intresset för den här aktien ska öka. Då. Men fundamentalt sett väldigt låg värdering på LMK Group fortsatt. Balder fick sänkt kreditbetyg från Moody's igår. Inte så mycket mer att säga, det är negativt naturligtvis. Vi ser dock att Balder har en förhållandevis stabil finansiell situation. Vi har en köprekommendation med en riktkurs på 65 kronor. Det var allt från oss för idag. Vi hörs igen imorgon. Tack!